I have a habit of writing things down. Always have. Even now, with my hands the way they are, the left one shaking if I hold a pen too long, the right one missing 2 fingers at the second knuckle, I write things down. My supervisor used to call it a liability. Said I kept records the department would rather not have kept. He said that in 2019, and I remember thinking he was being paranoid. That was before Ellis Island, before the zones, before February. My name is Leonard Moreland. I worked for the American Documentation Authority for 11 years, specifically in the Anomalous Landmark Division, which most people outside the department called the Monument Desk, or sometimes, among themselves, the Dead Man's Posting. I was a field analyst. My job was to collect, assess, and classify reports that came in from monuments, historic sites, national parks, and any federally protected landmark that generated what the ADA called irregular phenomenological activity, the polite term for things that should not be happening near places that were supposed to be symbols. I am writing this in what used to be a supply closet on the 3rd floor of the ADA's Philadelphia Annex. It has a cot, a chemical toilet, a battery lantern, and about 40 notebooks I have filled over the past 3 years. There is a crack in the eastern wall through which I can sometimes hear the zone boundary oscillating at night. It sounds like singing. I have learned not to listen too carefully. I want to be precise about what I saw and what I did not see. I am not a soldier. I am not a scientist. I am a man who read reports for a living and who, at several critical junctures, insisted on going to look at things with his own eyes when the report stopped making sense. Most of what I know because someone handed me a folder and I refused to set it down. So, from the beginning, the first report that came across my desk that I could not explain away was dated June of 2014. It concerned Ellis Island. The reporting agent, I will not use her name, she asked me not to, and she is still alive as far as I know, described a structural anomaly in the Statue of Liberty's pedestal. A chamber that did not appear on any architectural record, any renovation schematic, any classified infrastructure survey. A chamber that smelled, per the agent's field notes, like something between ammonia and the inside of a long-sealed freezer. The agent estimated the chamber's volume at somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 cubic meters. That is not a small room. The agent also noted, in a secondary observation she had marked with a question mark and a small asterisk, that the stone walls of the chamber appeared to have been smoothed not from the outside, but from the inside, as though something that lived there had worn them smooth over a very long time. I filed that report in the anomalous subcategory, flagged it for secondary review, and handed it up the chain. My supervisor at the time, not the one who called me a liability, the one before him, signed off on a full containment assessment. That assessment took 2 years to complete and concluded that the chamber was a ventilation artifact from an early design iteration. The structural consultant who signed that conclusion retired 6 months later. I have never been able to find out where he went. In 2016, I was reassigned to the Washington Zone before there was a Washington Zone, back when that corridor of the country was still just called the Mid-Atlantic District, and the only thing unusual about it was that bird migrations had been running slightly off-pattern for about a decade. The ADA's position was that the bird thing was a climate artifact. I drove through that district a lot over those years. The birds were not migrating wrong. The birds were avoiding specific areas with what I can only describe as deliberate precision. A line of starlings will break around a building to avoid going over it. I have seen that. What I was watching near the monuments was different. The breaks were miles wide. The animals were not avoiding the structures. They were avoiding something beneath the structures. I wrote that observation in a notebook. My supervisor, the liability one, crossed it out with a red pen when I included it in my quarterly report. He said, "Leonard, do not editorialize, just report." Fine, I just reported. Here is what I reported. between 2016 and 2021, from my field assignments across 6 monuments and 4 historic sites, recurring low-frequency acoustic events beneath foundation levels that did not correspond to seismic activity, geological survey data, or any known industrial source. Temperature irregularities in sub-basement environments that defied seasonal patterns. 3 instances in which maintenance workers described hearing voices in subterranean passages, voices that were not human voices, exactly, but which used patterns that resembled language. 2 instances in which those maintenance workers subsequently required psychiatric evaluation. 1 instance in which the maintenance worker in question was found 3 weeks later, perfectly healthy and calm, in a part of the monument's lower structure that should have been physically inaccessible. He did not remember the 3 weeks. He had developed in that period an interest in origami. I do not include this last detail to be strange. I include it because it becomes relevant later. The acoustic events were what I kept coming back to. I am not an acoustician. I had to learn on the job, reading manuals at night, consulting papers from university geology departments under cover of vague professional inquiries. What I eventually came to understand was that the sounds I was cataloging were not incidental. They had structure. They had something close to rhythm. And over the years I cataloged them, I began to notice that the rhythms were converging. Different monuments, different substrates, different acoustical environments, and the patterns were beginning to synchronize. I brought this to the department in early 2020. I laid out 14 months of spectral analysis, 3 independent acoustic consultations I had arranged out of my own pocket, and a map showing the geographic convergence pattern. I sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of the main ADA building in Washington, and I put that map on the table. My supervisor looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Leonard, we know." That was the moment the shape of things changed for me, not because of what he said, because of how he said it. There was no surprise in his voice, no bureaucratic defensiveness, just the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of a man who had been carrying something heavy for too long and had run out of reasons to keep pretending the weight wasn't there. "How long?" I said. He told me the ADA had maintained what he called an active knowledge file on the acoustic convergence since 1987. 1987, 3 years after the reports first surfaced from the Ellis Island monitoring stations. 3 years after the first documented emergence event that the department had classified at a level I was not cleared for and had never been shown. He slid a folder across the table. It was thick. The cover page had a designation I had never seen before, not a standard ADA classification code, but something older, a format I didn't recognize. At the top, in capital letters, it said, "Lurker Assessment Ongoing." I will not try to summarize that entire folder here. Some of it I still do not fully understand, but the core of it was this: the entities living beneath America's monuments were not new. They were not foreign. They were not the product of any recent event or any accident of geology or engineering. According to the oldest documents in that file, documents that traced back to correspondence between federal surveyors in the 1820s and 1830s, the entities had been there before the monuments were built. The monuments had been built on top of them, in some cases with the knowledge of specific men in specific positions of power. In other cases simply because the ground in those locations had a quality that drew human settlement and human reverence across centuries for reasons no one had ever been able to articulate cleanly. The pedestal of the Statue of Liberty was built to accommodate something. Frederick August Bartholdi, according to a recovered letter in that file, received a series of structural requirements from a source he described only as the American interlocutors. The requirements changed monthly for 4 years. They stopped changing once the dimensions of the pedestal were finalized. The chamber inside was not an accident or a ventilation artifact. It was a housing. I sat in that conference room for a long time after my supervisor left. The building was mostly empty. It was a Tuesday evening in February. Outside the window, the city went about its business. Lights in office buildings. A bus moving through the intersection below. A woman walking a dog on the sidewalk, the dog stopping to investigate something under a grate, the woman tugging the leash gently, both of them moving on. I thought, she does not know. The dog probably does a little. Animals are better at this than we are. But she does not know, and she is walking past a monument right now, and she has no idea what the monument is sitting on top of. Then I picked up the folder and started from the beginning, because that is what you do when you finally get access to the file. You start from the beginning. You read every page. You do not skip anything. What lived beneath the monuments was not one thing. That was the first correction I had to make to my mental model, reading through that file. I had been imagining a single entity, or a single species, some subterranean organism that had colonized the foundation rock under historic sites. The reality was more complicated, and in ways I was not prepared for, more terrible. The entities were related. They shared something, a substrate, a medium, a dimensional space that the file referred to by a name that had apparently originated with the first surveyors who encountered evidence of it. Wonderland. I'm not going to pretend that name sounds appropriately serious. I know how it sounds, but the word had been in use in the Ada's classified files for nearly 200 years, and the people who chose it were not being whimsical. They were using the closest English word they had for something that did not have a good English word, a place that was not exactly a place, a dimension that occupied the same coordinates as ours, but at a different angle to reality, a space in which the normal rules of geometry did not apply, in which distance and direction were negotiable, and in which something lived that had been there, by the estimates in that file, for longer than human beings had been building things on this continent. The things in Wonderland had a form, the file's biological assessments, and there were many of them, stretching back decades, drawing on everything from sonar imaging to the accounts of people who had entered the sub-basement spaces and come back changed, described organisms that had once been something else, something closer to what we would recognize. The transformation was not instantaneous. It was geological. Extended exposure to Wonderland's substrate altered biology in ways that accumulated across lifetimes and then across centuries. What entered human, or near human, emerged as something that retained faint structural echoes of its origin while becoming fundamentally, irreversibly other. The acoustic signature I had been cataloging was those entities communicating, not with us, with each other. The synchronization I had charted was them aligning, preparing, possibly, moving towards something. The file's final assessment section, written in 2018 by a team whose names were redacted, used a word I have not been able to forget: threshold. They were approaching a threshold. I went back to my supervisor the next morning. He looked like he had not slept, which was probably accurate, because he had handed me that file and then presumably spent the night contemplating what it meant that he had handed it to me. "What do you need?" he said. "Access to every acoustic log we haven't shared with me. Access to the Ellis Island containment files from 1985, and I want to know about the trees." He was quiet for a moment. "The trees are in the file." "Not all of them. There's a gap between 1992 and 1997, 5 years of blank assessment entries. I want to know what happened in that gap." He gave me the trees. I wish he hadn't, but he did, and I read them, and so I knew what was coming before most of the department did. The special trees. That is what the file called them, and that is what I will call them here because the name, for all its simplicity, captures something accurate. They were not trees in any botanical sense. They were structures. Organic in some properties, crystalline in others, rooted not in soil but in the dimensional membrane between our space and Wonderland. They appeared at landmarks. They grew slowly, over years or decades, in locations that the acoustic surveys consistently flagged as high-activity nodes. They looked, from a distance, like trees. Wrong trees with proportions that made the eye want to slide off them, with branching patterns that never quite matched any known species, but close enough that for years they were logged as unusual vegetation and passed to the Park Service for assessment. The Park Service would assess them, find nothing conclusive, and file the report. That was the gap. The 1992 to 1997 gap in the tree assessments was not a documentation failure. It was a policy decision. There had been an incident in 1991 involving a survey team that got too close to a tree specimen near a major landmark in the Northeast. I am not going to describe the incident in detail. What I will say is that 3 members of that team were recovered, all in medical distress, all exhibiting the same symptom profile as the maintenance workers I mentioned earlier: the confusion, the lost time, the subsequent fixations on strange crafts and geometric patterns. One of them, the team lead, had begun writing mathematical proofs on the walls of her apartment. Proofs she could not explain. Proofs that, according to the 2 mathematicians who were later shown photographs of the walls, were internally consistent and pointed toward conclusions that should not have been reachable from standard mathematical frameworks. She had been inside Wonderland. She had come back. Her brain was trying, in its limited 3-dimensional way, to process what she had seen. The policy decision made in 1992 was, stop getting close to the trees. For 5 years, the assessments were blank because the assessors were doing their assessments from a significant distance, with long-range imaging equipment, and documenting only what they could see without approaching. What they could see was the trees growing, getting larger, and very slowly over those 5 years beginning to move. Not move the way a plant moves, tracking light or sending out root tendrils. Move the way something moves that has decided to go somewhere, slow enough that you had to compare images taken months apart to notice it, but deliberate, directional, converging. Converging toward the monuments. By the time I received full access to those files, in the spring of 2020, the trees had been inside the foundations of at least 9 major landmarks for somewhere between 6 and 12 years. The ADA knew. The ADA had been managing what it called the cohabitation situation with the assumption, apparently derived from an analysis I found unconvincing, that the trees and the deeper entities were in equilibrium, that they were not accelerating toward the threshold, that the timeline was manageable. The timeline was not manageable. I started writing my own assessments in parallel with my official reporting at this point. Notebooks, not because I was planning to leak anything or build a case against anyone, because I needed to think clearly, and I have always thought more clearly when I write. The department was focused on containment, managing the public information environment, maintaining the landmarks in operational condition, maintaining the fiction that they were simply landmarks, while quietly trying to understand what it would mean if the threshold was crossed. I thought about that threshold constantly, what it would mean, what would change. Here is what changed. In November of 2020, a C-Thanaut team, that was the ADA's term for the investigators who worked in subterranean and subdimensional spaces, a name that had apparently been coined by a classical studies professor who consulted for the department in the 80s and meant, roughly, sailors of the underworld. A C-Thanaut team operating under the Ellis Island Monument entered the subbasement level that my original 2014 field report had described. They went in with full equipment, documentation rigs, acoustic monitoring, the works. They were in there for 6 hours. 4 of them came back. The 3 who did not come back were not found. The 4 who did were physically unharmed. 2 of them could not speak. Not mute, they were making sounds, attempting language, but the sounds did not correspond to any language any of us recognized. After several days this resolved and they returned to normal speech, but they described the experience of those days as feeling like they had 2 sets of memories in their heads simultaneously, running in parallel, neither one quite winning out. The senior C-Thanaut, a woman named Eleonora Vasquez, a name I noticed matched, closely enough to give me a long sleepless night. The name of the immigrant witness documented in the original 1954 Ellis Island report. Vasquez reported that the chamber had changed substantially since the 2014 survey. The chamber was larger, not because it had been excavated or structurally altered, because the dimensional membrane at the chamber's rear wall had thinned to the point of near transparency. She said that if you stood at the back of the chamber and looked at that wall, you could see through it. Not to more rock, to something else, to a space that extended in directions that did not map to north, south, east, west, up, or down. And in that space, at distances that were impossible to estimate, things moved. The things were massive. She could not give me dimensions because dimensions did not apply cleanly to what she was describing. She said, "Imagine the largest thing you can imagine. Then imagine that the largest thing you can imagine would be lost in the space between its scales." She said they were not hostile. She said that carefully, and she said it more than once. She was a precise woman. She said, "They did not react to us. They did not look at us. They did not acknowledge us in any way. They were oriented towards something else entirely. We were below their notice. We were below their notice the way a particular bacterial colony on a particular rock at the bottom of a particular ocean is below your notice when you are walking to the kitchen to get a glass of water." That was November 2020. By March of 2021, I had documentation from 14 separate sea thanaut incursions at 11 different monuments across 6 states. Every incursion confirmed the same pattern. The membrane was thinning everywhere. The entities on the other side were enormous, and they were moving toward the surface with the patient, grinding certainty of geology. I stopped sleeping well around this time. I want to be honest about that. I am not a person who has ever had trouble sleeping. I am not prone to anxiety in a clinical sense. But there is a specific kind of difficulty that comes from knowing something that most of the world does not know, and knowing that what you know is not a problem with a human-scale solution. I would lie awake doing the math. The entities in Wonderland were, by every estimate we had, orders of magnitude larger than the largest things alive on our surface. They were operating on a time scale that made civilizations look brief. They were not attacking us. They were not even noticing us, and somehow that was worse. Because what do you do with a threat that isn't a threat? What do you do with something that could end everything you know simply by completing a natural process, the way a glacier ends a valley by being a glacier? What do you do with that? You document it. You keep writing it down, because the documentation is the only thing you can control. My supervisor pulled me off active field assignments in the summer of 2021. He said it was for my own safety. I believe that was partly true. I also believe that my reports were becoming inconvenient, not because they were wrong, but because they were right, and the assessment team responsible for maintaining the manageable timeline position was under considerable pressure, and my reports kept making the timeline look less manageable. I was reassigned to the Washington Annex's Archival Division, which sounds like being put out to pasture, and in operational terms it was. But it also meant I had access to every document the Ada had ever collected on the monuments, the trees, the lurkers. That was the sea thanaut's term for the entities closest to the membrane surface, the ones that had been in contact with the substrate the longest and had changed the most, and the acoustic convergence data going back to the earliest records. I read everything, all of it. I made copies of things I wasn't supposed to copy, which was against regulations, and I will not apologize for it here, because the regulations existed to protect information, and information that no one can access is not information. It is silence dressed up in a filing cabinet. In the winter of 2021, I found the Arnoldson files. The Arnoldsons were a family. They had been in irregular contact with the Ada since the late 90s, through channels that were neither fully official nor fully unofficial. The kind of relationship a large bureaucratic institution maintains with civilian witnesses when those witnesses are credible enough to dismiss at potential cost, but too destabilizing to bring fully inside. Virginia Arnoldson, the daughter, had had a direct encounter with one of the special trees at a site in Manhattan in 1999. She had gone through the tree. She had come back. She had come back different. Not in the way that frightened the Ada. Not confused, not unable to speak, not geometric proof writing on the walls different. She had come back with information. Specific, detailed, coherent information about the structure of Wonderland, about the entities that lived there, about what the trees were and what the larger entities were, and what the relationship between them was. Her account was in the file. It took me 2 days to read it properly. Not because it was long, it was about 40 pages, but because the concepts she was trying to convey kept requiring me to stop and rebuild my mental models and start again. Here is what Virginia Arnoldson told the Ada in the winter of 1999, and what the Ada classified at the highest level they had and buried for 22 years. The special trees were not invaders. They were not separate organisms with their own agenda. They were structures, exactly as I had described them to myself, but the right analogy was not architectural. The right analogy was anatomical. They were extensions. Sensory organs, perhaps, or something fulfilling a similar function for the larger entities, reaching up through the membrane to sample the world on the other side. The larger entities used the trees the way we use our fingertips. They were feeling the surface. For a very long time, they had been feeling the surface. The entities themselves, the massive ones Vasquez had seen through the thinning membrane, the ones beyond the chamber wall at Ellis Island, Virginia Arnoldson described them as having been something once that we would have found recognizable. She did not know what. She said that information was not available to her in Wonderland in a form she could retrieve, but the impression she had, moving through that space, was of something ancient and vast and profoundly transformed from whatever origin it had once possessed. The transformation had been so complete and had taken so long that the origin was more like a geological trace than a living memory, a fossil record of a prior self. She said they were not malicious. She said that word with the same care that Vasquez would use 20 years later independently, and I noted the repetition in my notebook. They are not malicious. They are not even curious about us specifically. They are completing something, a process that was already underway before the first human foot touched this continent. The monuments are not incidental. The monuments are nodes, the way certain biological structures are nodes in a larger system. Intersections where the membrane is thinnest, where the trees can reach most efficiently, where the convergence toward the surface can proceed most readily. The entities were coming up. They had always been coming up. They had been coming up for hundreds of millions of years. We built our most significant structures exactly on top of the places where they were coming up, because those places had a quality, a resonance, a gravitational pull on human meaning-making that drew us there across every culture and every era. We had been living on top of this for our entire history. We had been building our most sacred and symbolic places directly above it. And now they were close. Virginia Arnoldson's assessment of the timeline, offered in 1999, within 25 to 30 years. The Ada buried that file in 1999. They buried it, and they maintained the manageable timeline position, and they continued to operate on the assumption that something could be done. Some intervention could be mounted. Some containment strategy could hold. I sat with that file in the archival room of the Washington Annex on a cold morning in November of 2021, and I understood, clearly and finally, that nothing was going to be done. Not because the people in the department were negligent or cowardly, though some of them were, but because there was genuinely nothing to be done. You do not stop a geological process with a containment strategy. You do not negotiate with something that is not aware of you. You do not win a confrontation with something that is not having a confrontation with you. The entities were coming up. That was a fact of the universe we lived in. It had been a fact since before our species existed. The only question was what we chose to do with the time we had left before the world we had built became permanently unrecognizable. I chose to keep writing it down. This probably sounds futile. I have had that conversation with myself many times over the past few years. Why document something no one can act on? What is the point of a record that exists only to record? Here is the answer I keep coming back to, and I believe it more now than I did when I first articulated it. The documentation is not for action. It is for truth. There is a difference between knowing a thing and having a true account of a thing, and the difference matters in ways that go beyond utility. We are a species that tells itself stories about who we are and where we came from and what our world means. Those stories shape every decision, every relationship, every institution we build. If the stories are wrong because someone made a policy decision to bury the true account, then everything built on those stories is built on a false foundation. The entities coming up through the memorial stones were not wrong. They were not evil. They were simply what they were, completing what they had always been completing. What was wrong, what I could not accept as simply the way things were, was the lie, the deliberate maintenance of ignorance, the decision, made by people with authority I did not have, that the truth was too destabilizing to allow. The truth was always going to be what it was. The least we could do was know it. February came. I was in the Philadelphia Annex when the zone boundaries activated. The ADA had been preparing the zone infrastructure for over a year. The division of the contiguous states into 3 administrative regions, Alcatraz, Rushmore, and Washington, was framed publicly as a federal reorganization, an efficiency measure. Nobody who read the announcement closely enough would have found any announcement to read, because the announcement was internal and classified, and the public information strategy consisted entirely of not making any public information available. The zone boundaries are hard to describe to someone who hasn't seen one. They are not physical barriers. You can walk through them. Technically, people did in the early days before the effects became better understood. They are regions where the membrane thinning has progressed to the point where the physics of Wonderland bleeds into the physics of our world in localized ways. Light bends differently near them. Sound propagates strangely. Animals and insects won't cross them. At night, if the sky is clear, you can sometimes see colors at the boundary that don't correspond to any wavelength in the standard visible spectrum. The seathonauts call those colors the singing spectrum. The name is more accurate than it sounds. On February 22nd, I was at the window of the Philadelphia Annex, watching the Washington zone boundary oscillate in the distance when the acoustic event happened. The one I had been dreading for 2 years, since the convergence patterns in my charts had all pointed to a single, eventual focal point. I did not hear it exactly. It was below the range of normal hearing, but I felt it. Everybody in the building felt it. The floor moved in a way that was not a vibration. It was a displacement, as though the floor had briefly existed in 2 places at once and then resolved back to one. Colleagues came out of their offices. Somebody dropped a coffee cup. The building's emergency lighting tripped on and off. I went to my supervisor's office. He was already on the phone. He looked at me and shook his head, not in a way that meant everything was fine. In a way that meant what we had known was coming had arrived on schedule, and there was no longer any point in managing the timeline. The Liberty Lurker emerged that day, from beneath the pedestal, through the chamber wall, through the thinned membrane. The entity that had been the first Lurker documented in the ADA files, the entity that had been living in that chamber since before the monument was built, the entity that was, and I still have trouble writing this down, even now, because it changes the shape of everything when you say it plainly. The entity that the deepest files identified as the remnant of something that had once, in an unimaginably distant past, been a person. A specific person. A person who had walked into the membrane long ago, and had never come back as anything we would have recognized. It emerged. The monument's structure accommodated it. The pedestal slid open along seams that had apparently been there since construction, designed for this, designed by the interlocutors who had given the measurements to Bartholdi, designed for the moment when the entity inside would complete its transformation and be ready to rejoin the substrate. I watched the satellite imagery on my supervisor's computer screen. The zoom level made the figures on Ellis Island look like specks. The entity was not large in the way the Wonderland entities were large. It was large in the way that a thing is large when you are standing next to it. It moved with a slowness that suggested not lethargy but weight, the weight of something that had been still for a very long time and was still adjusting to the idea of motion. It went into the water. After that, the Washington zone sealed. I have been in the annex since then. 3 years now. 3 years in this supply closet with my notebooks and my battery lantern, and the sound of the boundary singing at night through the crack in the wall. I want to be clear about what I am not saying. I'm not saying we lost. That framing assumes a contest, and there was no contest. The entities were not trying to defeat us. We were not defending against them. We were sharing a planet with something that had been here far longer than we had, something that was completing a process we had been built on top of and never told about. There was no war. There was a threshold crossed. There was a change made. What I am saying is that we knew. Some of us knew, and the ones who knew chose not to tell, and the ones who told chose not to listen. And the record that existed was buried in filing cabinets and access-restricted databases and classified assessment folders that were never meant to see the light. I am the light. That is what I decided in that archival room in Washington in November of 2021, reading Virginia Arnoldson's account of what she had seen in Wonderland. I am not a soldier. I am not a scientist. I am a man with a notebook and a methodical approach to documentation. And the best thing I can do, the only thing possibly that has any value in this new shape of things, is to write it all down. Every detail, every suppressed report, every folder that should have been opened and wasn't, every person who saw something true and was told to file it in the anomalous subcategory. The entities coming up through the stone don't care about my notebooks. They are not going to be threatened by them or altered by them. They will finish what they are finishing, and the world will continue to change in ways that no containment strategy was ever going to stop. But there will be a record, accurate, detailed, stubbornly maintained in a supply closet in Philadelphia by a man who still has most of his fingers. A record that says, we were here, we saw this, we knew this, we chose, some of us, to say it plainly. Vasquez told me once, before the zone boundaries hardened and I lost contact with the Seathonaut teams, that the thing she remembered most clearly from her time in the sub-basement chamber was the sound. Not the entity sounds, not the acoustic convergence, but the silence of the human being standing next to her, watching the thinning membrane, understanding what they were seeing. She said, we were terrified, obviously, but we were also just looking at it. 8 of us, standing in the dark under a monument that the whole country thought was a symbol of one thing, and we knew it was something else, and we were just looking at it. She said she had never felt more human, and she couldn't explain exactly what she meant by that, but she knew it was the right word. I think I know what she meant. We are the species that looks, that stands in the dark in front of things that are vastly beyond us and looks at them steadily and tries to understand them. We do not always succeed. We do not always get the information in time. We do not always make the right decisions with what we know. But we look. We write it down. We try to make a true account of the thing we are looking at, even when the thing we are looking at could end us without noticing. The entities in Wonderland are older than us by a margin I cannot meaningfully express. They are larger than us by the same margin. They were here before we were here. And they will be here in whatever form they take after this transition is complete. They are not evil. They are not good. They are what they are, and what they are is genuinely beyond our capacity to fully comprehend. But we looked at them, we documented them, we kept a record. I have 40 notebooks. I have been writing for 3 years. Outside this building, The zone boundary oscillates at night, and sometimes what comes through the crack in the wall sounds like singing, like something enormous and ancient communicating at frequencies below the threshold of normal hearing, below the threshold of normal understanding, below every threshold we built our institutions to protect. I keep writing anyway. That is the only thing I know how to do that is mine to do. It is not a strategy. It is not a solution. It is just the stubborn human insistence that what happened here will be known, that the truth of this will not stay buried in a filing cabinet, that someone, somewhere, someday, will be able to read a record of what we saw and what we did with what we saw, and will understand that at the end of everything in the supply closet, the man with the notebooks kept going. The crack in the wall is wider tonight. The singing is clearer. I am still writing. I should say something about the Arnoldsons, because they deserve more than a footnote in my account. Lauren Arnoldson, Virginia's father, died in 2018. The official cause was listed as cardiac arrest. He was 61 years old. I read his file too in those Washington archival weeks. He had spent 20 years in irregular correspondence with the Ada, trying to get them to take Virginia's account seriously, trying to get the 1999 assessment open for full review, trying to do the thing I eventually gave up on doing, change policy from the outside. He did not succeed. The policy did not change. The file stayed buried, and Lauren Arnoldson had a cardiac event in his apartment in late December of 2018 and was found by his daughter 3 days later. Virginia survived the zone boundaries. She was already in the Washington zone when they hardened. I tracked her through our irregular communications network, the one the Seathonauts maintained on channels the Ada's administrative layer didn't monitor. She was last located in the vicinity of the Rockefeller site, which had been the location of her original tree encounter in 1999. There were reports, unconfirmed, that she had gone back through. I do not know if she is alive. I do not know what alive would mean for someone who has crossed the membrane twice. I know that she spent 20 years carrying information that the people with the power to act on it refused to receive, and she kept offering it anyway. She kept trying. She wrote letters. She made calls. She showed up at Ada offices with documentation, with her own notebooks, with the quiet persistence of someone who had been to Wonderland and come back, and decided that the most important thing she could do with what she had learned was to make sure it did not stay lost. That is also human, the persistence in the face of institutional refusal, the refusal to accept that the true account does not matter because the people with the filing authority have decided it does not matter. I recognize it because I have felt it. Every analyst who has ever put a real observation in a report and watched it get crossed out with a red pen has felt it. The Ada's last formal communication to the field division before the zone boundaries hardened completely was a one-paragraph memo directing all staff to maintain operational protocols and refer public inquiries to the Standard Information Office. Standard Information Office. We were watching the membrane of reality thin to transparency under our most iconic landmarks, and the last official communication from the top was a reminder to direct public inquiries to the appropriate channel. I kept that memo. It is in Notebook 37, folded between 2 pages of acoustic analysis. I keep it because it is also part of the true account, the institutions we built to manage the truth about our world, making their last gesture a bureaucratic formality, not out of malice, out of the deep institutional instinct that what cannot be publicly explained should be procedurally contained. It is not a villainous impulse. It is a very human one. The desire to maintain order, to keep the shape of things recognizable, to not let the enormity of what is happening overwhelm the machinery that keeps people fed and housed and going about their days. I understand that impulse. I do not share it, but I understand it. What I keep thinking about, in the long, quiet nights in this supply closet, is how many of us there were. How many people working the monument desk across 11 years, how many Seathonauts going into the sub-basements, How many archivists and analysts and field consultants and acoustic specialists? How many people knew, at various levels of completeness, what was under the stones? Thousands at minimum. Over the decades, tens of thousands. All of them doing their work, filing their reports, going home at the end of the day and feeding their dogs and watching television, and talking to their families without mentioning what they had seen that day. Not out of indifference. Out of the same thing that makes all institutional silence. The sense that the information is above them, that it is being handled at a level above them, that someone with more authority and more context is making the decisions, and it is not their place to circumvent the hierarchy of knowledge. I was that person too, for years. I was the person who wrote accurate field notes and handed them upward, and trusted that the chain of authority was doing something responsible with them. It took me 11 years to understand that the chain of authority was not doing something responsible with them. It was maintaining the manageable timeline position. It was telling itself that the problem was containable, and adjusting the timeline forward every time the evidence suggested otherwise. The evidence always suggested otherwise. Here is what I want the record to show about the human beings who worked this problem over the decades. We were trying. Imperfectly, institutionally, with all the distortions that come from hierarchy and classified access levels, and the genuine difficulty of communicating information about things for which we had no adequate language. We were trying to understand, to document, to prepare. The people who made the bad policy decisions were not stupid, and they were not entirely cynical. They were frightened, and they were operating in systems that rewarded the appearance of control and punished the acknowledgement of things that could not be controlled. Fear does that to institutions. Fear of the unknown does it most of all. We were afraid of the right things. We just could not find a way to be afraid of them honestly. I think about the immigrant woman from the 1954 Ellis Island report, Eleonora Bramante, the name that appeared in the original documents, the name that matched the name Vasquez had been given at birth and had changed after marriage. I do not know what that connection means. It might mean nothing. It might be a coincidence of names in a long and complicated document history. Or it might be something that Wonderland does, some fold in the narrative of individuals that connects people across time in ways that have no physical explanation. I do not know. I have written it down. It will be there for whoever reads these notebooks to assess. The woman in 1954 stood at Ellis Island and smelled something wrong and saw people being led into the base of the monument. She was not from here. She had crossed an ocean to be here. She was starting over in a new country, and the first thing she encountered was the smell of the wrong thing emanating from the pedestal of the country's most famous symbol of arrival. She lived her life here. She raised children. She told her story to an ADA agent in 1974, 20 years after the fact, because she had read a news article about unusual seismic readings near Manhattan and decided that someone official should know what she had seen. She was in her 70s by then. She told the story clearly and completely and was thanked for her time, and her account was filed in the anomalous subcategory. She kept living. She died in 1989, 4 years after the Lurker emerged from the pedestal in 1985, which means she was alive for that emergence. I wonder if she heard about it. I wonder if she knew that what she had witnessed in 1954 had finally come out into the light in a way, and that her account of it, buried in a file she never had access to, had been, all along, precisely correct. I hope she knew. I have no way of knowing if she knew. What I know is that she told the truth about what she saw. An old woman who had emigrated from Italy decades earlier, who had no reason to expect anyone in authority to believe her, who had every social incentive to let the memory fade and not make herself conspicuous by reporting strange things to government agencies. She told the truth about what she saw. She did it once, and it was buried, and she presumably never knew it was buried. That matters to me. The small acts of accurate witness, made by people with nothing to gain from them and nowhere to file them, that would make a difference. The world is full of those acts. The record of how things actually are is maintained, minute by minute and generation by generation, by people who simply refuse to say that what they saw was something other than what it was. I am one of those people. I have always been one of those people. I did not choose it exactly. It is more that I noticed early on that I was constitutionally incapable of writing in my reports that what I had seen was a ventilation artifact, when what I had seen was a chamber worn smooth from the inside by something very large over a very long time. I could not write ventilation artifact. I could not make my pen form those words when I knew they were not true. That is the whole of it, really. That is the entire foundation of what I am doing in this supply closet with these notebooks. Not heroism, not strategic resistance, just the inability to write ventilation artifact when I know it is wrong. The zone boundary is singing tonight with particular clarity. 3 distinct tones, cycling in a pattern that I have heard before. I have it charted in Notebook 22, from a monitoring session outside this annex in the fall of 2 years ago. The pattern corresponds to what the acoustic analysis team called an active resonance cycle, which they believed indicated elevated dimensional activity at the membrane level. I wrote it in my notebook then. I am nodding it here now. The crack in the eastern wall is about 2 centimeters wide at its widest point. Through it, on clear nights, I can sometimes see the singing spectrum colors at the zone boundary. Not tonight, there is cloud cover. But I can hear it well enough through 2 centimeters of cracked plaster that I have to remind myself not to listen too closely, because listening too closely to the sounds from Wonderland has a documented effect on human cognition that I would prefer to avoid. I have 40 notebooks and I intend to fill more of them, and for that I need to maintain the cognitive architecture that allows me to write coherent sentences in sequence. So I write about the sound instead of losing myself in it. That is the trick. Not avoiding it, you cannot avoid it. It comes through the wall whether you want it to or not. But keeping the pen moving, keeping the words forming, maintaining the record as the sounds wash over me, because the sounds do not care about the record, and the record does not need the sounds to stop in order to exist. The sounds will keep going. The process will keep going. The entities will complete what they are completing in their own time at their own scale, indifferent to everything we built on top of them. And I will keep writing. Because I am a man in a supply closet in Philadelphia with 40 notebooks and a cracked wall, and on the other side of that wall, something incomprehensibly ancient is singing in a range below normal hearing. And the only thing I have ever known how to do that was worth doing was to write down the true account of whatever I was looking at. So I am looking at this, and I am writing it down. And there is no one left to cross it out with a red pen. I should record, for completeness, what I know about the other monuments, the full picture. The Lincoln Memorial, the Lurkers, as the Seathonauts called them, were the entities closest to the surface in the Washington zone. Smaller than the Liberty Lurker, smaller, but not small. They had been documented in the subbasement surveys since the 1960s, occupying spaces beneath the statue's chamber in configurations that suggested confinement rather than habitation. The Lurker at Ellis Island had been contained, in a sense, by the feeding arrangement through Ellis Island, immigrants redirected, a dark and terrible compact that had apparently held for decades. The Lurkers had no such arrangement. They were simply there, waiting, in a space beneath the most prominent portrait of human governance in the capital city. The presidential decree that confined them, document 447B in the Ada's sealed files, signed in a year I was not permitted to see, by a president whose signature I recognized but whose name I will not write here, was the kind of document that makes you understand why certain things stay classified. Not because the information is dangerous, because the information, once read, cannot be unread. Once you know what was agreed to, and by whom, and in exchange for what, the institutions built on top of that agreement look different. Not shattered, just different. like a building that looks sound from the street and whose foundation you have just been shown. The foundation held. For a long time the foundation held. Mount Rushmore was different. The entity associated with that monument had, by the time I received the relevant file, been in what the assessors called an infection state for years, a condition in which the membrane boundary was not thinning but spreading laterally, extending the zone of dimensional overlap across the surrounding terrain. The Black Hills had been exhibiting anomalous behavioral patterns in wildlife since the early 2000s. Not avoidance, the opposite. Animals drawn toward the monument from distances that made no ecological sense. The assessor's hypothesis was that the infection state produced a localized attractor effect. Something in the resonance of the expanding membrane pulled organic life toward it. The sea thonauts called this the hunger radius. The term was informal, not official, but it persisted in field reports because it was accurate. There was a radius around the Rushmore site within which animals moved wrong, moved inward, moved toward the faces carved in the stone with the patient, inexorable wrongness of something that is being called rather than traveling under its own direction. I spent time near the boundary of that radius once. In 2019, on a field assignment I was supposed to be conducting for an entirely different purpose. I stayed on the edge. I did not go in, but I could feel it, that pull. Not magnetic, not gravitational, something more internal than either of those things. A pressure in the decision-making apparatus of the brain that kept suggesting, quietly and persistently, that moving forward was the right thing to do. That moving forward would resolve something, that there was something worth moving toward. I stood at the edge of that radius for about 4 minutes, and then I walked back to my vehicle and drove until the pull was no longer perceptible. I wrote 4 pages of notes that night in my hotel room. I did not include the description of the pull in my official report. I was not sure how to characterize it in official language. I included it in my personal notebook. I include it here now. There is a specific fear that comes from feeling your own cognition being pushed on by something external. It is different from the fear of a physical threat. Physical threats engage the body, the breath, the heartbeat, the legs that want to run. This was quieter. This was the fear of watching your own decision-making apparatus receive input from a source you did not consent to and having to actively override it. 4 minutes at the edge of a hunger radius, and I was overriding something for most of them. The people who were inside the radius, the people in the nearby towns, the tourists, the Park Service employees, I do not know what their experience was. The ADA's monitoring data did not include cognitive assessments of individuals in the affected areas. I have wondered about it. I have wondered if they noticed, or if the effect at normal exposure levels was below the threshold of conscious awareness, something that shaped behavior without announcing itself. I have wondered if a lot of things shape behavior below the threshold of conscious awareness, and whether the monuments, in their long decades of being monuments, have been doing something to the people who visit them that we have simply categorized as awe or patriotism, or the ineffable power of significant places. Probably I am overextending the evidence, but I write it down. The Suez Canal event was the ADA's biggest failure of the period, in my assessment. I am not going to be diplomatic about that. When the Department of Defense authorized the thermonuclear detonation to resolve the cargo ship grounding in April of 2021, the ADA filed 3 separate formal objections. I was the analyst who wrote the second of those objections. I spent 4 days on it. I laid out in detail the acoustic resonance data suggesting that the Suez Canal region was an active membrane-thinning zone, and that a thermonuclear event in that location risked accelerating the threshold event by an unpredictable margin. The DoD dismissed all 3 objections. What emerged from the seabed afterward was not a lurker in the traditional sense. It was something generated by the event itself, not a native inhabitant of the subdimensional space beneath the canal, but something produced by the interaction of the detonation with the membrane in a location where the membrane was already compromised. The acoustic profile was wrong in ways that the sea thonauts found disturbing. It was not synchronized with the convergence patterns. It was arrhythmic, reactive. The sea thonauts' term for it was, informally, the crab. It stuck. I do not know why that particular shape was what the event produced. The assessor's hypothesis was that the form was not inherent to the entity, but was a function of the local substrate, the geology, the sediment, the specific dimensional properties of that location shaping the emergence into a recognizable morphology, the way water shapes itself to the container it occupies. It was large. It was not moving toward anything in particular. As of the last report I received before the zone boundaries hardened and my access to international monitoring data became unreliable, it was simply present, a new thing in the world produced by human action, following no pattern we had anticipated, answering to no protocol we had designed. That is the part that keeps me up on the worst nights, not the entities that had been there for geological epochs, completing their slow and inevitable process. Those I have made my peace with, in the way you make peace with continental drift. But the crab, the thing we made by being careless with the tools we did not understand, the thing that was not going to happen until we made it happen. We are a species that makes things happen. Sometimes the things we make happen are good. Sometimes they are the Suez Canal event. The distinction, in retrospect, often comes down to whether we were in possession of the true account of the situation before we acted. We were not in possession of the true account of the Suez Canal situation. The people who made the decision had been insulated from the true account by 17 layers of classification, and the manageable timeline position, and the deep institutional need to believe that the problem was being handled at a level above them. The problem was not being handled. The problem was geological. The problem had always been geological, and we detonated a nuclear device in the middle of it because we needed to move a cargo ship. I have written this down before, and I am writing it down again, because it is the clearest possible expression of why documentation matters, not as a record of heroism, not as a narrative of triumph, as a record of what happens when the true account is suppressed and decisions are made without it. The world we live in now, the zone divisions, the boundaries singing at night, the monuments that are no longer simply monuments, is partly a natural consequence of a process that was always going to complete itself. And partly it is a consequence of decisions made without adequate information, by people who were operating on a false account of their situation, because the true account was in a filing cabinet they were not cleared to open. I had the clearance in the end. I read the files, I wrote the notebooks. And I am sitting in a supply closet in Philadelphia, listening to something sing through a crack in the wall, and I am adding this to the record, and the record will be here when someone can read it. Whatever comes next, whatever the world looks like on the other side of this transition, there will be a true account of what happened here. 40-odd notebooks in a supply closet, filled by a man who could not make his pen write ventilation artifact. That is not nothing. I think, on the nights when the singing is loudest and the boundary colors are visible even through cloud cover, that it might be the only thing, the only specifically human thing in the end, that turns out to matter, not the monuments we built, not the institutions we constructed to manage the knowledge of what the monuments were sitting on, not the strategies and policies and classification levels and manageable timeline assessments. Just the record, just the stubborn, quiet, entirely useless and entirely necessary act of writing down what is true. The singing is very clear tonight, clear enough that I can hear the intervals between the tones, and the intervals have a structure that I find, against my better judgment, almost beautiful. I am going to close this notebook now. I am going to open a new one. I have work to do.